So we've been talking about coalition talks earlier in the programme. It looks and feels like David Seymour is close to getting a deal, but some speculation coming out or swirling around that his referendum on defining the Treaty of Waitangi principles is he's not going to get that. The question then, I suppose, is what replaces it? What are you hearing, Carmen?
What we could replace it with is a bit of public education, actually, because we're actually, non-Māori and Māori are really ignorant around what is te tiriti, how do we make it work, what is the history of it, how did it become part of our law, all the principles. So those principles were purposefully kept quite loose and able to be adapted over time through all of our legislation and how the courts look at them. So there's always been these arguments amongst our experts and academics around it. So New Zealand is actually ignorant about how the treaty works and how it should work. But we should be in control of how we want it to work. That referendum I have a problem with because it always comes back to the platform of discrimination. Now, they talk about discrimination, that Māori shouldn't get all these rights, etc., etc. But the problem is that the current systems are discriminatory. They're discriminatory against Māori. They discriminate against people who are in our low socio-economic groups. So this idea of discrimination is coming from a Pākehā perspective, coming from the fact that they have money, there is wealth there. So it's the people who have wealth and privilege who determine that everybody else has been discriminatory in our practices and our policies. It's just not true. There needs to be an acknowledgement about the discrimination that currently exists in all of the systems that govern Aotearoa New Zealand.
And this is the conversation that we have to have as a country, isn't it, Ben? What do you see? You know, what ACT wants is a massive departure from how the treaty has evolved over time, you know, in law well,
it's completely ahistorical.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't reflect at all any kind of conception of what the treaty would have meant to the people signing it, or how the principles have been interpreted, or how, you know, we've kind of lived with it. You know, it's an attempt to rewrite the treaty as you would want it if you were a libertarian, classical liberal party, right? Which, I mean, look, that's fine, but that's not what the treaty is, and that's not what the principles of the treaty are. And because of that jurisprudence, there will be all sorts of unintended consequences. So it's a bad policy, and it's also bad politics. This referendum would completely swallow up the first 3 years of this government for, you know, really very little gain. You know, that's not to say that there aren't things that need to be addressed.
Yes.
You know,
Right.
I mean, like we talk about the Peter Ellis case. You know, courts are meant to decide the case in front of them, and instead we had the Supreme Court sort of thinking out loud about the application of tikanga to a dead Pākehā man who did not at all adhere to principles of tikanga in his own life, you know, as a way of sort of thinking out loud about those topics. You know, I think, you know, a lot of people will be sympathetic to the idea, I think, that there does need to be a sort of reining in of, for instance, the judicial activism that's happening in this space. And I think that that's somewhere where ACT and National and New Zealand First could much more profitably spend their time.
Well,
also,
yes,
how
Carmen.
expensive is it going to be? Like, how do you actually draw out all of this? Referendum goes ahead, and we know what happens in referendums. It's the people that always vote that end up getting what they want, right? So we know we already know what the end result of a referendum will be. No matter what the questions are, no matter how divisive it gets, getting to the point where we go to a referendum, if we go to it. But as all the experts have already said, it's a waste of time. It's a policy that doesn't need to exist, especially in the first 3 years. But there are things that can be addressed. The other thing, how expensive will it be? How do you actually draw out all of that law out of our court system, out of our legal system, out of all of our businesses? Use principles, it's everywhere. We're past that point. We need to have better and much more mature national conversations around te tiriti o Waitangi. And National have also, it's one of their values, that the Treaty of Waitangi is a foundational document of New Zealand. It's in their values.
But also it's very important that the government doesn't just pay lip service to this, right? If they're talking about being good treaty partners, it shouldn't just be waiata practice and te reo lessons at lunchtime and $40,000 paupiri for your own staff members. That doesn't help anybody. It certainly doesn't help Māori. And that aspect of government culture has gotten out of control over the last 6 years. And that's something that they can actually change and that they can do something about.
Although there is an argument for equity. You have to do more to get equality. So at some point, if we'd had adhered to the treaty right from the start, the way Māori had seen it in the Te Reo Māori version of the treaty, how we are now, where you see non-Māori using more Te Reo Māori, using karakia, doing waiata and haka all over the world, everywhere, all these things would have been part of our culture more back then rather than now. So more and more we are seeing all New Zealanders embrace Te Reo Māori, cultural practices of Māoridom, which belong to this country, which belong to this land and belong to everyone who are part of this land.
Okay.